Hello, my name is Michelle Cale, and today I'm going to tell you the story of the scandalous failure of the Birmingham Penny Bank. Bank failures were common in the mid-19th century, but it was still shocking when Birmingham's Atwood, Spooner and Marshall Bank failed on the 10th of March 1865. This great private bank had been in business since 1791. It collapsed with liabilities of £1 million, leading to widespread turmoil in the town. There was further alarm just a week later when the Birmingham Penny Bank suspended payment, leaving more than 7,000 working-class people facing the loss of their hard-earned savings. The Atwood's Bank failure may have been the proximate cause of a run on the penny bank, but in truth, the maladministration of its managers was to blame. As the committee charged with investigating the penny bank's failure was to conclude, an unchallenged facade of success had combined with lack of oversight to enable a culture of unethical behaviour and fiscal recklessness. Penny banks were wholly unregulated. From the late 1840s, they were established to encourage thrift among the poor by enabling the saving of small amounts of money. They were usually associated with another institution, such as a school or church. The recommended operating model was conservative. The penny bank would receive small deposits, hold its accumulated funds in an account at a respectable local bank, and return money to savers as they needed it. Overhead costs were to be kept to a minimum and largely covered by interest received from the larger savings bank. From the outset, it seems that the founders of the Birmingham Penny Bank were resistant to this simple model, for when they corresponded with James M. Scott, the founder of early penny banks in Greenock and Hull, they judged his advice unsatisfactory. The Birmingham Committee embarked on their own version of the penny bank, which unfortunately made the fundamental mistake of believing that a penny bank was actually a bank, which it was not, for it had no capital. The founders proposed two layers of management. The first was themselves, a committee of directors which would be responsible for the day-to-day business, and one of whom would volunteer to be the superintendent of operations. As you can see, the founders were on the lower end of the middle class, not men of large means, and certainly lacking the capital typical of private bankers. Barlow and Brake were sole traders. McBride was a waged employee, while Churley, Suckling and Haynes were employees of financial organisations. Granger, Hawkes, Johnson and Wallington were in the business of providing retail goods and services. By 1851, some of them were already active participants in public life, especially in the promotion of freehold land, which had arisen as part of the campaign to extend the franchise. The creation of the Birmingham Penny Bank may have seemed a logical next step, bringing together their business interests with a desire to enhance their public profile and perhaps even help their working class neighbours. Building on their existing connections, the founders solicited some of the town's establishment figures to form a second layer of management for the new penny bank, a board of trustees, presumably to increase the credibility and social standing of the new establishment. The Morning Advertiser reported that many of the most respectable inhabitants had become the principal officers. A philanthropic institution, run by enthusiastic townsmen guided by knowledgeable entrepreneurs, looked set for success, but appearances were deceiving. The involvement of the trustees was minimal. Aston attended one meeting, Baldwin and Goodrich just two, while Schofield, Chance and Winfield attended none at all. By April 1852, just 15 months after the commencement of the penny bank, all of the listed trustees and officers had either resigned or quietly stepped away. No resignations were publicly announced, and no efforts were made to find replacements. The managing committee were on their own and accountable to no one. Why the trustees decided to part company with the Birmingham Penny Bank is unclear. Perhaps poor management practices by the directors created alarm at the risks to the trustees' reputations. Certainly things did not go well right from the outset. But the trustees made no concerns public, and the bank's minutes suggest no interventions by the trustees, which could have put the institution on a better footing. That the trustees effectively washed their hands of responsibility for the bank would be raised as a severe criticism during the investigation which followed the failure in 1865. The remaining directors engaged in 3 practices which doomed the penny bank to failure. The first was making frequent personal loans and mortgages to themselves, their friends, and their business associates. It's not easy to tell from the surviving minutes the whole extent of these loans, but as an example, in May 1855, finding itself unable to meet the withdrawal requirements of its customers, the bank urgently called in parts of loans made to Hawkes, Suckling, Barlow, Churley and Haynes, amounting to £325. In 1858, Granger and Haynes went bankrupt because of ill-advised business involvement with Richard Heath, an electroplater. Heath owed money to the penny bank too, which was lost in the failure of his venture. On occasion, the penny bank also received loans from its directors to help with cash flow, including £250 from Thomas Luckman Johnson in April 1858, which was subject to repayments with 6% interest. The second bad practice was the making of investments that were both risky and illiquid. Rejecting the usual practice of keeping depositors' money in a secure bank account, the Birmingham Penny Bank used that money to buy shares in and make loans to a number of other financial organisations. Research reveals that the directors were deeply involved with many of them. In essence, the penny bank directors used the funds of their working class depositors to support themselves and their other business interests. It was a severe conflict of interest, a situation not lost on Henry Suckling, who resigned as a director in August 1858 on the grounds that the other directors did not accept personal responsibility for the money invested in the recently failed Birmingham Discount Company, the principal shareholders of which included George Batterson Haynes, James Granger and William Churley. In 1854, the directors spent £888 on buying land in Union Passage and erecting a new office building, with plans to lease space to other businesses. But this project became another financial burden, as maintenance costs mounted and tenants were tardy in paying rent, leading to legal fees. To avoid having to put the building at risk in the Granger and Haynes bankruptcy in 1858, the directors sold it to their fellow director, Thomas Luckman Johnson, for £1,000, and he agreed to lease it back to them for £60 per annum. The investigation committee flagged this as a dishonest transaction, which was in truth a loan from Johnson to the bank. The purchase of 10 acres of land in the Selly Park estate, a sale handled by George Haynes as secretary of the county's Permanent Building Investment and Loan Society, turned out to be particularly ill-considered. The land was advertised in February 1856 at £400 per acre, suggesting that the penny bank directors invested a huge £4,000. Yet far from enabling the erection of valuable villas for discerning gentlemen, the penny bank's acreage remained undeveloped and in 1859 was let for grazing. The title to the land was also problematic. In 1864, Hawkes and Wallington, by then the last remaining active directors, were engaged in legal struggle with Thomas Luckman Johnson over who actually owned it. It was a cascade of bad decisions, made worse by the third practice, poor record keeping. We can't know exactly how bad, because none of the bank's financial records survive, but the investigation committee appointed to explore the failure noted that they were confused, meagre, and in a lamentable state of incompleteness. The depositor's ledger was incomplete to a point where it was impossible to understand exactly how many accounts the bank held, nor exactly what money was owed to savers. It also appeared that up to £1,700 had been lost through fraud, but by whom could not be determined, and the apparent loss might even have been an accounting error. It was all a terrible mess. The remaining directors, Hawkes and Wallington, together with Thomas Luckman Johnson and George Barlow, who had sought to resign just before the bank's failure, were brought into the bankruptcy court. It was eventually concluded that almost £9,000 was owed to around 7,000 depositors, and that due to their unlimited liability, the directors of the penny bank were responsible for it all, but, alas, they did not have sufficient funds to pay. In the end, the matter was dealt with outside the bankruptcy court. The 4 directors made limited contributions from their personal assets. The bank building and the Selly Park land were sold. A subscription was got up in the town, including a working man's fund, which eventually enabled the penny bank's depositors to receive 11 shillings and threepence in the pound. The losses were shocking and regrettable. Even more shocking to the investigation committee was the reluctance of the former trustees to agree they shared responsibility for the penny bank's failure. Schofield, Aston, Baldwin and others eventually contributed money to the subscription but admitted no liability. No criminal proceedings were ever brought against any person connected with the penny bank. The story of the penny bank's failure is one of tension between expectations of moral rectitude and lack of regulation, with the veneer of good public reputations masking immoral behaviour. Any initial philanthropic intent was quickly undermined by a cavalier attitude toward conflict of interest and a willingness to make risky investments and ill-considered expenditures. As for consequences, as a result of this astonishing mismanagement, working-class people in Birmingham lost their savings, the reputations of the former trustees were damaged, and the directors themselves were bankrupted. No proposals for tighter regulation followed, but the widely discussed scandal may have increased scrutiny of other penny banks and promoted interest in the new post office savings bank. And perhaps Birmingham's public men took the advice of the investigation committee to be more thoughtful about where they bestowed their patronage in future.